housekeeping. I've also got some help today in the shape of Andrew Wolfe, who is going to help me look at the chat. Obviously, we'll try and keep an eye on it, both of us, and get to questions as quickly as we can. If we do miss your question, please feel free to ask it again, just in case if there is kind of lots of activity in the chat box. So if we don't get to it, please feel free to ask it again, make any comments, and we'll try and hopefully keep up with the activity that's kind of ongoing. So welcome, and I'm just going to introduce you to the panel before I ask ACC Ritchie to start. So today we have three members of the panel. So first of all, we have ACC Gary Ritchie, who is responsible for operational collaboration and partnerships within Police Scotland. Previously, he was a local policing commander for Dumfries and Galloway, and we're very privileged to have him as part of our SIPR Executive Committee. Our second speaker today is HMIC Lead Inspector Brian McInulty, who joined HMICS in 2009. Prior to that, he has an operational policing experience, having joined Strathclyde Police in 1989. He's been engaged in a variety of roles and has extensive experience of operational policing, including being a divisional commander. And in 2019, he was awarded the Queen's Police Medal. My name, as I said, was Professor Denise Martin. I'm a criminologist at the University of Aberdeen. I'm also the Associate Director for the Education and Leadership Network for SIPR, and I have been engaged in policing research for just about 20 years now, looking at a variety of issues, but latterly particularly learning and development and training in policing. So I'm just going to hand you over to ACC Ritchie. Thank you, ACC Ritchie.
Thank you, Denise, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was just reflecting to Denise, a big audience isn't quite as intimidating when you're just in a screen there, so I'm probably a bit more relaxed than I would be, but I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We're about to find out, I suppose. So my role, and when we're going to talk about leadership, I want to talk about a very specific element of police leadership. My role includes developing public health approaches and moving the police into that particular environment. We do that because it's a legislative requirement for Police Scotland, because the legislation which underpins the development of the service is focused on is not only improving the safety of communities, but improving the well-being of communities, which is quite a significant step. There is a focus on prevention and reducing demand, not just in policing, but across that whole system. And the other element, probably the most important element that we're going to touch on, is maintaining the legitimacy of policing and the relevance of policing, because without that, then policing doesn't have consent. And if we don't have consent of the public, we don't police with the support and the confidence of the public, then we won't operate as effectively as we should as a service. So in an ordinary year, I would be speaking to you today about the naloxone programme that we were going to be rolling out, or the mental health approaches that we're taking in policing, or the development of collectivism and collective leadership across the system. But it's not been a normal year, of course, but I think a lot of those issues we could probably explore in just a little bit of detail over the next 10 minutes by looking at our response to policing the coronavirus and the impact of the coronavirus on that. So I get asked to give a lot of inputs, and it's absolutely to do with my role and nothing to do with the quality of input, I can assure you. But I'm preparing a presentation this year, and I've got a working title on it of how to police a zombie apocalypse. And that's not in any way to be flippant about what we've just gone through. It's just quite simply, I think, to highlight the fact that there are absolute parallels in terms of the unexpected nature of what we've dealt with, the broad impact across society, the game-changing nature the level of threat, the basis around health, the fear factor among the public, and the measures, the quite significant measures that we've had to take as a society. To me, it might as well have been a zombie apocalypse we were dealing with. So internally in policing, I don't really think that's where the real interest is in leadership, because we react to critical incidents and crises in a very structured way. We're trained, we have policies, we have command and control, and it's very vertical, very command and control. And that allows us to organise around whatever the crisis is, and we can scale up or down depending on the significance of the critical incident that we're dealing with. So we had to scale up quite significantly in terms of our leadership response internally for COVID-19, but it more or less follows that tried and tested model, and that gives us, I think, a bit of internal competence and assuredness in how we deal with incidents such as this. Far more interesting to me in respect of police leadership here was very much the public-facing one and the role that policing has played in that broad system approach to dealing with the coronavirus. It became clear very early on that the behaviour of the population was going to have to be controlled, and because of the critical nature of what we faced, that control would need to go beyond mere guidance and advice from government. It would need to be legislated, and that legislation would need to carry with it significant gravitas if we were going to alter people's behaviours. Clearly, there would be a key role for policing in that in terms of enforcement. Now, that brought with it a significant concern for us. And when you think about the principles that I spoke of before about the legislative requirement, the focus on prevention to reduce demand across the system, that legitimacy, relevance and consent, all of those factors come into play. And the one thing that we speak about and making sure that we can navigate that balance quite effectively is the importance of values-based policing. And that has really come to the fore. Because, as I say, we were particularly concerned about the implications for the policing, not just in response to the virus and the demand that might create for us while we were dealing with the issues ourselves internally, but also what it would mean for the future of policing in terms of our relationships with the public, etc. And one of the concerns was clearly the development of legislation. Now, if you consider, just as an example, off the top of my head, the legislation that was developed to stop people using mobile phones in cars, that took about 18 months to 2 years from initial stages of consultation to implementation. We were dealing with legislation which would prevent you from leaving your house, prevent you from going outside, which was developed in about a week. So our concern about that was the far-reaching nature of it, and clearly, and I don't mean this in a critical way at all to the government, but the concerns about the quality and the effectiveness of that legislation. And we felt that as being in the front, really in the front facing of it, the front foot, I suppose you could say, of making sure that that legislation was enforced and impinging on freedoms which people would consider as being inalienable in respect of just leaving the house and being outside. There was a real challenge there to the bond of trust that we have with the public. So values of integrity, fairness and respect, which are our organisational values based around human rights, really came to the fore very early on. And our Chief Constable stood his ground with government and consultation with government in respect of operational independence. So it's very much a case of, yeah, that's fine if you want to develop legislation, of course that's your job, but the way that the police employ it is very much independent of government interference. So that is why we developed, as you may have heard, the 4Es approach, whereby we would go through a continuum of, first of all, engaging with the public. Secondly, explaining the legislation. Thirdly, encouraging people to comply with the legislation, and then a big gap to the fourth E, which would be enforcement. So we've got legislation in place that we don't want to enforce, and we've been really, really open about that. That it's an absolute last resort, and we would far rather see the public taking responsibility themselves. But if we need to enforce, we had to. We will. We created a system to actually record our interactions, and I believe the architect of that system is part of the audience tonight. And that was the first time we would actually record our interactions with the public and have our officers take note and hold as data an engagement, a one-to-one engagement. We also, of course, recorded our enforcement, and that allowed us to build up a database in that. We publicised that data very openly right from the start, so that people could see our interactions and the level of our enforcement as a ratio of that. We kept a very close eye on public confidence and how public confidence was being affected through our policing, and we commissioned independent assurance through the development of an IAG under the stewardship of a prominent human rights lawyer, John Scott. And we shared more information than we ever have. Now, there's an aggregation of benefits to that for me. First of all, to me, that's a values-based approach. That is all about integrity, fairness and respect and human rights. It is all about being open, and it is all about maintaining that bond of trust. And the aggregation of benefits, first of all, became clear in respect, and we were able to be clear with our messaging to our officers and what we expected them to do, and we were broadly consistent in that. Showing that we are reluctant to enforce the law shows that we understand just how significant that law is, and how groundbreaking it is to actually start policing, as I say, what we would consider individual freedoms. Being completely open in the sharing of information helps build that trust, along with the independent advocacy that came from the IAG. And that leads to increased confidence, which in turn gave us a very strong platform when it came to dealing with the government as further legislation was developed through the course of the pandemic. So we had the face covering legislation coming in, the quarantine legislation, even the new legislation that we have now. The fact that keeping the eye on public confidence, which is increasing and has increased, means that we in our negotiations with the government have a very strong credibility. It continues to be a very difficult approach. I've often likened that to walking a tightrope in policing at the moment, because on the one side you have the vast majority of the population wanting us to be more enforcement based, if you like, because they see contraventions all the time and recognise the threat. On the other side, you have a large part of the population who take exception to having their individual freedoms policed in such a invasive way. And they're not two distinct groups. People flip from side to side depending on whatever context they find themselves in at times. We don't get it right all the time, but we have, I think, by and large, got that approach. We've got the consistency, which I think has led to an increase in public confidence. It continues to be a challenge, and I think the other issue in that is because of the speed that legislation has been developed, it's been difficult for the public to actually understand what the police powers are and what the laws are. And I think a lot of people probably have seen that playing out in glorious Technicolor in the video that was going about in the incident in Aberdeen just from last week. But I think what we've taken there, as I say, is a good example of how a values-based approach to policing and a values-based approach to leadership and collective leadership as part of a whole system can strengthen public confidence and can strengthen your mission as an agency and your delivery of that mission in a way which improves your credibility and improves that public trust and confidence that you rely upon. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. I'll hand over to Brian now. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Denise, and thanks, Gary, and good evening, everybody. Nice to see some happy, smiley faces and some former colleagues there as well, even if it is only virtually. And I'll just correct Denise's kind words of introduction to me. I didn't retire in 2009. It does feel like 11 years ago, but it was just last year that I retired from policing. So it has been a strange year, as Gary has said. Listen, thanks for the opportunity to speak at today's conference on behalf of HMICS. As Denise said at the start, this area for discussion today is looking at the current position of police leadership and the challenges that police leaders face, and importantly, how to develop leadership as a way to meet these challenges. And in the joining instructions, it goes on to say that demands on police leaders are increasingly complex. And I think really you would struggle to find anyone who would argue with that, particularly when you consider the current landscape. And Gary's spoken about the challenges over the course of the last year with the pandemic, and the fact that we are all dialing in from home and many people are working from home. I guess that brings its own challenges in relation to leadership. But actually, beyond that, we're at a point in time when budgets are shrinking. The Police Service of Scotland is going through a programme of transformation, the scale of which has never been seen before in Scottish policing. And relatively speaking, the force itself is a very young and still developing organisation. And I think, as Gary said there, the level of scrutiny now that the police are under, and I'm talking about the service, but also about officers and staff who are delivering that policing service day in and day out. And Gary talked about social media there. It's really like nothing we've ever seen before. And again, Gary alluded to this. I think the manner in which the police have responded to the current pandemic is a good example of that, because we do see now, I think, a divide in public opinion that's really quite different from anything that we've seen before. So these are increasingly complex demands, but I would say they are increasingly complex demands for everyone involved in policing, not just for police leaders. So really that, I suppose, raises the question, what differentiates leaders from the officers and staff in Police Scotland who are delivering policing services day in and day out? What's really distinct about the role of the leader? And that's really an important question for me. And I'll talk a little bit about the review that we did, but for me, you can talk about, and Gary's talked about that engagement with partners, a whole systems approach, the setting of strategic direction for the organisation, which is really critical. And then at various levels, the implementation of tactical and operational plans. And there are specific duties that come with various ranks in the service. But for me, when you talk about leadership, far more fundamental than those things for me are supporting people and supporting the officers and staff in performing their role, to help those individuals give of their best. Sometimes that means motivating people, it means challenging people to give of their best, looking after their safety, and that's particularly relevant just now, looking after their well-being, their welfare, their developmental needs, to enable them to flourish within the organisation, personally and professionally, and to maximise their own potential within the organisation. And all of that really is on an individual basis, but also collectively with teams that leaders are overseeing. And ultimately, I guess, all with a view to making sure that the best possible level of service is being provided to the public. Now that sounds easy when you say it quickly, but it's certainly not easy. And for me, leaders themselves need to be supported properly, and they need to be prepared for that considerable challenge. And throughout my own police service, and I think probably everybody can relate to this, I observed myself and experienced the impact of a lot of good leaders, but also some less effective leaders. And I would say that the majority of people that I have encountered throughout my service, and this was true too of the inspection that we did, were effective, well-intentioned, professional people who are trying to do their best for their teams. But I think we've all experienced less effective leadership at some point in our own careers, and that really can have a devastating impact on people. And just reflecting on that ahead of today's conference, I think for me, in the less effective leadership that I saw throughout my service, it appeared to me that the person demonstrating these behaviours was often not confident in the role that they were being asked to perform. They were insecure, or they appeared to be insecure, but often didn't have the emotional intelligence to recognise that within themselves. And they would often behave in an inconsistent manner from one day to the next, so you wouldn't really know what kind of mood you were going to find that person in. And of course that leads to all sorts of challenges around trust and confidence in the leader. Now, we can probably all recognise some of that. Hopefully it's not too common, and I don't think it is at all. But I think that we all can have our moments, and I can certainly speak from my own leadership journey that there were certainly times when I didn't get things right, and I probably did display some of those behaviours that I've just spoken about. And I've certainly not met yet a leader who's on their A game all of the time, because leadership is certainly not easy. And that, to me, is why it is really critically important that people are given the right development to prepare themselves for these roles. And certainly throughout my own policing career, I was very fortunate to have a lot of training and developmental opportunities. Each and every time I was fortunate enough to be promoted, I was sent to the Scottish Police College and given access to a new leadership course, whether that be the First Line Managers course, the newly promoted Inspectors course, or the Senior Leadership Development courses that were ran regularly for Chief Inspector and Superintendent ranks, but also other opportunities through some joint training with partner organisations and through the Institute of Leadership and Management with the military, and through CPOL, the European Agency for Law Enforcement Training. A lot of investment throughout my service that certainly allowed me to feel prepared better than I would have been without that training, and ultimately I think it helped me do my job a little bit better than I would have without that level of investment. But one of the other things for me that really was important about all those opportunities was the network of support that developed for me, because often leadership can be a lonely experience, and having somebody that you've maybe been through a training course or a training experience with, that you can access, pick up the phone to, and talk them through a challenge, an issue that you're facing, was really, really invaluable for me. And that really is a sort of personal reflection. But I think in terms of the current role that I'm doing, last year we conducted what is the first phase of a training and development review, looking at the training and development function within Police Scotland. And that first phase was really focused on leadership training, career development, the new appraisal process within Police Scotland, which is called My Career, and the new leadership pathways promotion process. And both of these processes were at the stage of being developed at the time of our inspection. We conducted a significant number of interviews, carried out focus groups with officers and staff throughout Scotland. We engaged with a number of stakeholders, including the Scottish Government, Police Scotland themselves, clearly, the Police Authority, the trade unions and staff associations. And we also sat in a lot of the governance meetings, looking at some of the strategic decision making that was being made around these issues. And we carried out focus groups with officers who were on the first line managers course that was being run at the Scottish Police College, or Police Scotland College, Tullyallen. There were 17 recommendations made in total in that report, and I think it's important to highlight just now, and it's not just because we've got Gary Ritchie on the panel that I'm saying this. It certainly did not come as a surprise to me to learn throughout the inspection that Police Scotland has a very strong chief officer team. And actually, if you look at the current force executive, and that group of officers have, in a similar way that I certainly benefited from a considerable amount of training and development, that generation of officers have also benefited from a significant amount of training, and many of them went through those same courses that I have touched upon. And for me, that has helped shape them to become the leaders that they are today. And one of the key findings from the training and development review that we carried out was that for a variety of reasons, that same level of investment in terms of running leadership training courses has not been there since the creation of Police Scotland. And the absence of those opportunities really makes me wonder what opportunities are being afforded to chief officers of the future. And you could ask yourself that question, what will the chief officer team in Police Scotland look like in 10 years' time? And that was one of the key recommendations that came out of the report, that the force really need to look at ensuring police officers and support staff are provided with leadership training beyond that which is provided for technical training as a matter of urgency. And I think Gary touched upon it, and I think it's right that for a long time the police service have been excellent at responding to crisis, and the training is there for that, and the developmental opportunities are still there. But when I talk about that gap in leadership training, I'm talking about, for me, what is those more fundamental issues about how to support officers and staff, how to have those challenging conversations with people, how to motivate people, how to look after people's well-being at a time when just now officers and staff are dealing with this pandemic 24/7. They're dealing with it professionally, and they'll obviously always have their own worries about their own family members, as we all do. I'd just like to touch on three other recommendations from the report. So that another recommendation that we made was that all police officers and support staff should be provided with appropriate leadership training prior to undertaking a supervisory role. And the reason for that recommendation is that what we did find, and this was particularly relevant when we met with the students in the first line managers course, was that quite often people would be performing the role of constable, and they would be selected to do an acting rank or a temporary rank at the rank of sergeant. They would do that role for perhaps around about a year typically, then apply for promotion, then become promoted, and about 6 months after that they would be sent on a first line managers course, which meant that they were receiving that training 18 months into performing the role. And certainly what we heard consistently was that training would have been far better provided before undertaking the role. And I know that that's not always easy to do that. We know how quickly sometimes there's a need to fill gaps, but that certainly was another one of the key leadership recommendations from the report. And another recommendation that I would just highlight is the need to ensure that diversity training is provided and mainstreamed into leadership courses at all levels as a matter of urgency, and that indeed will be an area that we will revisit in the phase 2 training and development inspection, which will look at recruitment, retention, development and promotion of underrepresented groups. And for me, that's really important, that training is bespoke and fit to the role being provided, to best prepare leaders to provide that leadership to diverse teams. And I think, just as a closing comment for me, I think one thing that is really clear for me is that leadership is not easy, and the more support that leaders are provided with, the better. And I think I'll leave it at that and hand over to Denise. Look forward to any questions later on.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you, ACC Ritchie. I mean, some of my comments are going to kind of follow on from what Brian said. And I think the sort of more broader issues about this being a holistic issue across the organisation and not actually just specifically about leadership. So I'm going to actually reflect on some work that I've done, and I think actually resonates with some of the stuff that you've kind of raised, Brian. But it was from a piece of work that we did with the Open University in collaboration with the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime in London. And this was a Home Office funded project that ran between 2018 and 19. It was a 2-year project. And we specifically looked at learning and development, so not leadership, but learning and development within the police service across England and Wales. Although we did engage with other police forces, including British Transport Police and the PSNI. And some of the findings, I think, are very similar to some of the points that Brian and ACC Ritchie kind of raised. And one of the things that we found specifically, and Brian raised the point about leadership training, you know, there'd been a lack of sort of leadership training available in Police Scotland since about the sort of change in structure in 2013, the reorganisation into Police Scotland. And we found actually a similar thing in England and Wales in many of the forces. And I think you kind of mentioned, Brian, quite a lot of issues like austerity. And when we did the research with the forces, which we did as a piece of action research, so in collaboration with many practitioners, we found that a lot of learning and development departments had been kind of stripped right back. And a reason for that was that learning and development wasn't really embedded within the organisation as a critical aspect of policing. Certain aspects of training were, so for example, operational training, which was seen as the priority and to continue, but other forms of staff development were not prioritised and seen as being really supplementary to the organisation. And what we found, and one of our key findings, was that training and learning development was really kind of based around a very kind of transactional model rather than a transformational model. And I'm just going to read you a quote out from one of the practitioners, a senior practitioner that we spoke to in the course of the research. And he said, "I think training, even for police officers, is largely transactional and problem focused, in that it's not about transformational, it's not about changing what officers do or preparing officers to raise their skill set. It's about solving problems that we've identified in the here and now. It's about giving them the skills in that area that we suddenly feel we're falling short in." So it's a very reactive piece, and this was a common theme, and we spoke to a number of different forces, small, large metropolitan forces across England and Wales, and there was the same sort of key theme was about that reactional piece around training and development. It wasn't an embedded process. It was about requirements, so you need to get your ticket so you can continue in your duties. It was a reaction to criticism. So, sorry Brian, but in HMIC inspection that required a reaction or some other form of external inquiry, and seen as a necessity. Okay, we're short on disclosure, we really need to suddenly train everybody in this. Let's get everybody through the door and get them trained quickly. We've got, 6 weeks to get it done. So that was the kind of basis of our research. At the same time as our research was kind of ongoing, what we've seen particularly within England and Wales was the introduction of a change really in the way that police kind of learning and development was viewed, and the introduction of the apprenticeship scheme, so the police degree apprenticeship in England and Wales. And for me, and I don't want to kind of engage in a debate about whether police should be degree educated or not, because that's not what we're talking about today. But I think my point is that there was a recognition through the introduction of the police degrees in England and Wales that actually we need to re-engage with learning and development, not just at the top of the organisation, so improving leadership, but actually, as Brian said, throughout the organisation. So new recruits coming in now in England and Wales have to go through the degree apprenticeship route. There's 3 different kind of entry routes at different levels, but they have to get that degree apprenticeship. But part of the reasoning for that was about professional development, about equipping staff with the skills and knowledge that they need. So we started to see a change in some of the police services that we work with in England and Wales, and some really good work going on in learning and development departments, a re-engagement with learning and development strategy, a desire to make change and to think about, well, not see the PEQF as something that was a burden, but actually an opportunity to think about how do we better equip and develop our staff, not just when they come into the organisation in the longer term. And certainly what we found was that there was a lot of work going into the PEQF, but when we spoke to frontline officers, we spoke to PCSOs, we spoke to control room staff, what we found was that they felt that, yes, this was a good development. What about them? What about the recognition and the understanding of their role? They also felt that often there was a lack of recognition within the organisation of their skill set, or even what skills were required, so a lack of kind of learning skills analysis. And sometimes staff felt, even though they had received a lot of training and development opportunities, that these were underutilised. So what I think for me was relevant from this specific piece of research, and what is relevant to the development specifically of leadership skills within the police as an organisation, is that we need to consider what knowledge and skills we require in the organisation. And I think it's not just about, you know, a reactive thing about, well, you know, we need to create new leaders, we need to have this like sudden kind of change. Is actually asking the questions in the first place of, well, what makes a good leader and how do we know that? What do we want from a leader within the police organisation? Literature and research on police leadership has suggested that we do tend to have a particular trait or a particular style that we adopt within the police organisation. And actually what we need to start to do is to think about leadership in broader terms. As Brian said, it's about actually, are there staff, if through development and opportunity, could become a good leader in the longer term? It's about creating more diversity in leadership. And I know, as Brian said, that is the next kind of focus for the HMICS's inspection. But I think going back to Gary's point, this isn't just about individuals and creating individual staff development. This is about the organisation as a whole and collaborating, thinking about the structures and processes that support existing leaders. Again, as Brian said, we have a really strong leadership team at the top of the organisation, but what about those in the middle of the organisation? How do we support those leaders to be more effective and better leaders? How do we support emerging leaders? And it's about thinking about our longer term structures and processes within the organisation. There's a tendency, I think, in policing, and I think Gary mentioned at the start, that in a crisis situation that we're currently going through, we tend to revert back to those kind of hierarchical structure, the command and control structure, which, yes, work very well in a crisis situation. But actually, we're not always operating in a crisis situation, or the police probably are always operating in a crisis situation, because there's a global pandemic, something else will emerge that we have to deal with. The police have to deal with continuing complexities, increasing social problems, and they need to also be part of the solution to those problems. I think the point I'm making is this isn't just about the police as an organisation, but this is actually about a broader piece. And I think Gary will recognise this working in the partnership space, but this is actually creating leadership that can't just work internally within the organisation, but have the skills and the knowledge and the abilities to work in an interactive space and to be able to relate to a broader set of organisations. yes, the police are used to working in partnership spaces as they have for several years. We work in collaboration, but increasingly, and as Gary mentioned, in the public health, which is a critical issue just now, and particularly law enforcement and public health, these two disciplines that sometimes have different priorities, is we need to try and overcome those kind of cultural divides. And we have to equip police leaders not just to deal with the internal structures and processes, but also to deal with the issues that they face in working with partnerships. And I think this is a really big kind of challenge for the police in the next few years, is how do we create these leaders that can work effectively internally, but also work collaboratively and develop strong relationships so we can actually find solutions to the social problems that face us now, but also in the long term in the future. And I think that's the biggest challenge for me around police leadership that we're currently having to deal with. And the systems and structures that we put in place now and develop now are going to create the leaders that have to deal with these issues. So I'm going to finish there. I'm not going to talk too much because I would like some time for questions, and I see the chat's already started to go. So I'm hoping that Andrew Riff's there to help me out and maybe identify some people that have made comments, or if there are people that want to ask questions. If anybody does want to ask a question, you can also put your hand up and we'll try and get to you and operate it. So don't know if you're there and you can sort of start feeding back into the comments.
Hi, yep, I think our first question's from Inga. I don't know if people want to open their mics and ask the question directly. It's probably easiest than me reading out the questions. So Inga, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. It was just, I mean, there's been quite a lot of discussion around public health approaches within policing and police-led public health approaches and the leadership aspect to that. I was just wondering if there were opportunities or an appetite for joint interprofessional learning at a leadership level, and maybe that's already happening, but I was just wondering if that was a possibility or if that's underway.
I can answer that. The short answer is yes, Inga. In fact, just last week I had a meeting with Angela Leach, Public Health Scotland, just to explore potential collaborations for us in the future, and one of those areas that we're looking at is where we can actually combine or interchange our leaders and what would be common spaces, speaking about that law enforcement and public health approach as well. If we're working with Public Health Scotland and developing leadership there, then you're developing leadership within the system rather than just within your organisation. So and there's been other examples of that as well. We used to do, Brian will remember this, we used to do placements, certainly in Strathclyde Police. This was something that we did years ago. I remember some of our officers going to Scottish Power and others going to BT, and that's probably kind of fallen by the wayside a bit, but it's something that, again, I think there would be value in us exploring, and that's something that in my area we're looking at. So that's like private space leadership, if you like, or private leadership and private industry, and the lessons that we can learn from that. And also internationally as well. So we're in a program with, developing a program with our colleagues in America who have not got their problems to seek at the moment, and in respect of sharing leadership practices also. So it's so yes, it's something that we're constantly interested in.
Can I just add to that? Sorry, Inga. Yeah, I mean, I'm actually kind of working with Police Scotland at the moment in that there's one of the recommendations that came out of the report was about trying to look at more collaborative kind of leadership. So I'm actually working with some colleagues, actually in Gary's team, to look at kind of how we develop collaborative leadership. So that is a process that's kind of ongoing, which I think is a really kind of positive actually move to look at how we kind of develop that space. So that I think that will be ongoing over the next few years, and getting police colleagues to work with people from different kind of public services. So as well, we're hoping to kind of evaluate that approach as well and see how that kind of works. But I think actually there's I think as Gary said, I think it should be embedded actually throughout the organisation, not just even at kind of, you know, a leadership level, but it should be something that's actually embedded at different parts, I think. I mean, I know we've had a conversation about interprofessional learning and actually even bringing people when they're studying, you know, they're training together, you know, so even starting it from a really early stage in the process so people actually get used to that kind of way of thinking about how other people, you know, look at the same issue, because health might approach it differently from, you know, policing, and we are still in that place. I think Gary made the point really well early on, where, you know, you've got that kind of public, there's a need to kind of obviously enforce things, but there's also that kind of safeguarding issue. So we need to kind of enforce the law, but we've also got to keep people safe, and sometimes those two things, you know, don't really kind of actually work collectively, and it can be a real kind of difficulty. So I think as soon as we actually get different groups together, even students, and I know you've done some work in this space yourself, I think it's really critical to start from the bottom up and as early as possible in people's career to start shaping that relationship, you know, so they could start their careers and have that career journey together, even though they might work in different organisations.
Thank you, Denise. I think Brian had a point to make, or he certainly put his hand up. Brian, do you want to come in on that?
Thanks, Andrew. No, it was really just, I think it's covered. It was just to highlight that certainly during our inspection, we did find, I would probably describe it as sort of pockets of good practice in terms of some of that joint leadership, some local arrangements with local authorities and local sort of finance or local universities and things like that. But actually, I think for me it's about the force having that more strategic approach to it, as Gary's alluded to there, so that can be maximised, because there's definitely an appetite out there, particularly when you look at local authorities and health boards who are all facing the same challenges in terms of resource and budget. When you talk about some of these generic leadership training opportunities, there is a real appetite to get people together, and I think there'll be real benefit and that's encouraging to hear that that's something that's been looked at.
Great, thanks, Brian. Bill, do you want to come in on that point just now, Bill Graham?
Yeah, thanks. It was really more of a general comment, alluding back to Brian, and it's been I was sitting shaking or nodding my head at everything you were saying, Brian, because I remember going back in the days, being made an acting inspector and sitting there giving it, oh my God, without any kind of formal training beforehand. And I think it was a point you made in the actual report about leadership for middle ranking and certainly for early ranks, because they don't have any training beforehand. And remember, being promoted into your first supervisory position or leadership position without any kind of training, it's frightening. And I think that's something that should be looked at. So it was really just to say, yeah, everything that you said, I totally agree with. And I do remember the days of partnership or people being sent out to different partners for training or for leadership perspectives. And it is invaluable, because nowadays, with working in a partnership approach, which is the norm, or it should be the norm, and having an understanding of how leaders from different organisations approach their work is crucial for the police. And I think it's something that has been lacking over the past years, and it's certainly something that should be looked at. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Bill. I think we should move on maybe to Andy's. Andy Tatnall's got a question here. Andy, do you want to open your mic and ask the panel?
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. There was just a question around leadership in Finland. The policing style embraces a values-based version of lean management, and that's been enabled in part through distributed leadership. So in other words, the frontline operational cops are empowered to deal with most of the tasks that they come across from start to finish. And I was struck by the contrast with the Scottish model, which is more so vertically and horizontally fragmented, i.e. Finland has far fewer leaders and far fewer specialist departments. And I was just wondering, given the pressures on police budgets, which are likely to get worse, you would imagine, after the pandemic, is this a model which Police Scotland have considered at all?
I can give a view on that. I think it's quite It's an interesting point. I mean, I would say that when you look at operational leadership, the level of responsibility that's on a constable just now is actually quite significant in respect of dealing with incidents and making decisions at the time. I guess where the real leadership structures come in, and this might be the point that you're making, is perhaps in response to a crisis. Andy, if we're dealing with a critical incident or something like that, we're very quick to throw a leadership structure round about that. And as I've said before, that's kind of been tried and tested and proven. So I don't see any real appetite for mucking about with that, for want of a better phrase. We're maybe a bit away from that. But the other point I would make that maybe ties in more with what you're saying is I think what we need to foster and develop in the service is a strong leadership culture right throughout the organisation, where people are not afraid to take responsibility and not afraid to make decisions, even if perhaps they're not decisions that they would typically make in the role that they're in or in the duties that they perform. That's maybe something that's been lacking before. We went through an exercise, and again, Brian will remember this keenly, and not long after the establishment of Police Scotland, when we looked at our leadership ratios, and we found that we were pretty top heavy, even more top heavy than we are, significantly more top heavy than we are just now. And in every area went through a process whereby we basically were, I was going to say we were under pressure, it's the wrong way to put it. We were asked to develop a model which delayered our middle ranks, in particular around about sergeants and inspectors. And what you see with that is first of all, from being honest, it's problematic. People become, I think, a bit challenged and a bit confronted by not having that safety blanket of their sergeant or their inspector at his or her disposal. But very quickly what you see is people rising to the challenge and actually getting on with the job, because one thing I think we are good at in policing across the country is that where we've got a problem, we'll get on with it and deal with it. So that whole process, I think, that we did in the early stages has probably led to a development of a culture of people taking more leadership responsibility. But I do agree with your point that we could probably go a bit further with that.
I'd just add to that, Andrew. Sorry, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting kind of issue actually, and I think that there is some literature on leadership that suggests flatter structures are actually kind of more effective, and that hierarchical, sort of structure that police have actually kind of maintains kind of cultures that make it difficult for kind of change and innovation to happen, and in a way, because sometimes it can make people fear. I think, that risk aversion where actually people are very kind of scared to challenge kind of anybody in a leadership position, or they sort of adhere to what's expected, and I think I meant to kind of say that in my kind of talk, I forgot, but there's a fear of kind of being disciplined or a fear of not meeting expectations, and certainly some of the research that when we spoke to frontline staff, that's how they felt. Although there's another, and I think, that's the point about what we're currently going through, that actually that kind of critical command structure is necessary, and research also demonstrates that sometimes, particularly in operational issues, it's actually kind of a critical structure that really kind of helps work through crisis. So I think it's a really kind of challenging issue. I think what it is, and I think what Gary made the point, is that it's about actually embedding kind of leadership across the organisation, and leadership doesn't necessarily kind of have to be horizontal, it can also kind of be vertical, and there's different strategies that where you can achieve that, whether it's through coaching or mentoring, and some people don't necessarily want to go up into what they consider leadership positions, but it doesn't mean to say they want to be developed or to have those skills developed. But I think it's just thinking about it in a different way and how we actually ensure that we support and manage staff and develop staff and develop their kind of knowledge and skills in the way that they want that to be done. But we certainly don't want staff to be in an organisation where they're kind of they don't sort of challenge their leader because they're in a position where they feel that they can't do that. And I think that's kind of negative, and we need to try and get rid of that rather than maybe the structures as such, because sometimes they work and sometimes they won't. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure.
Brian, did you want to come in on that as well?
No, it was just an observation. I think it's picking up on Gary's point as well about the work that was done following on from the creation of Police Scotland in terms of the line management structures and the sort of de-layering of all that. I mean, I think for me, and this is maybe just picking up on some of the comments that are on in the chat there as well, talking about middle managers being able to be innovative and feel empowered, if you like. Well, I think when you look at the scale of some of the command areas or all of the command areas in Police Scotland, I think gone are the days that the divisional commander would have their finger in the pulse of absolutely everything that's happening in the division, and at the morning meeting want to know every detail of what's happened. It's really went beyond that. I think for me it's a far more strategic role now that commanders and superintendents have in local policing divisions. And there is absolutely more responsibility on the Chief Inspector rank than there has ever been, who are now commanding fairly significant areas in their own right. Inspectors now taking command of big cities at times, being the senior officer overseeing a city. Well, when I was an inspector, there were quite considerably more inspectors on duty. You need a smaller area. So it's just about trying to make that adjustment for people and any sort of senior leader that wouldn't empower people, given the structures, they wouldn't last long because they would end up making themselves quite unwell. I think it's just too big a job. So I think there is absolutely, but that takes me back to that point about how those roles and ranks have changed and the demands on those people, and that to me is why there is that need for a new approach to training and looking at a training needs analysis being carried out that's specific to each of those roles to support those individuals performing them.
Thanks, Brian. Gary, did you want to come back in on that? I think you're muted.
I knew I'd be the first. It's just a point of emphasis again, what Brian had said. I mean, I'm sitting in my house in Ayr at the moment, and when I was a wee boy, Ayrshire was a constabulary on its own, with its own chief constable, and then it became Strathclyde, and then in Ayr you would have it would be a division of its own. You'd have a chief superintendent. And then after I joined the police, we had more management delayering, and you had a management team based in there, a sub-divisional officer, and the divisional commander was actually an Ayrshire divisional commander covering east, south and north. And now, as Brian says, it's a chief inspector, and he might actually be in the audience. I know certainly I've seen one of the more recent ones was in the audience. So you've constantly seen that kind of management delayering, and that in itself, I think, fosters what Andy was talking about there in terms of more responsibility, because the responsibilities and decisions don't go away just because the leader goes away. The responsibilities automatically get pushed down and ultimately onto the front line. And just the other point I need to make there, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not just an organisational thing. There's a massive public expectation. When I was a commander in Dumfries and Galloway and going through that delayering programme, the officers were generally quite accepting of it. With some it was problematic, as I'd said. The real issue was with the community and with the leaders. And I'm not blaming anybody here, but it was the thought of, and localism's a big thing for policing. The thought of losing that local sergeant or local inspector or local chief inspector was hugely problematic and impacted on public confidence. So every time you go through an exercise like that, you have to accept that you're going to take a hit in public confidence. So it's not just an internal decision. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Gary. I was just going to move on to Hannah's got a question here, I think picking up on Brian's point around training, which is around whether there's something about training courses versus exploring approaches that instill value-based leadership for me. So I wonder if there's anybody there, any of the panel, got any comment on that?
Sorry, Gary, I'll let you go.
Sorry, Brian. Very briefly, I think it's a balance. You know, as I say, if you're developing a leadership culture in an organisation, I think that's got to be based around that organisation's values. First of all, and the training element we've spoken about, you know, it's quite. I am well trained now. There's probably a gap in that in the middle ranks that we're speaking about. But I now have specific training in respect to strategic leadership, public order leadership, firearms leadership. These are skills I think that Denise had mentioned before, you know, that we are being trained for. And values-based leadership, I think, should be part of formal development, but it's within that organisational culture. So it's not necessarily you don't go in a training programme to become emotionally aware. I think, you know, that is through development within the organisation, within the roles that you undertake.
Yeah, I would just add to that briefly. I mean, I think just reflecting on what Guy said, that's what I said about really embedding learning and development within the organisation. I think, you know, it's a tendency to think that we could be trained to everything, we could suddenly do things. And yes, there's certainly things where that is required, like specifically, you know, operational training. And I have to say, like, you know, my experience of the operational training, you know, across the UK, that was actually excellent, really, really excellent. But I think it's actually more about how we, you know, when I said that learning development is supplementary, it shouldn't be. It's about how you actually, you can't, you know, as Guy said, you can't necessarily kind of sort of train a value, but you can actually make people feel valued at work or feel a valued part of the organisation through having strong systems that develop and support your staff. So that's how you would achieve that, and it makes them want to then, you know, be part of that leadership team or develop as a leader because they feel, you know, that kind of stronger tie to the organisation because they feel supported and got that development opportunities.
Thanks, Denise. Brian, did you have anything to add there, or?
No, it was actually going to just take it in a slight. I agree with everything that Gary and Denise have covered there, but I think the other thing for me, and this was something that featured in our report, was that need to move away from the sort of traditional Monday to Friday 9 to 5 training course where everybody has to go to the Scottish Police College to do a first line manager's course, if you like. It's just that importance of, you know, the force thinking a bit more innovatively about how they use technology. The fact that it's a 24/7 organisation, and probably at 4 o'clock in the morning, you might have a number of inspectors, for example, available to do a quick hour's development with each other if there was that opportunity, as opposed to thinking about it within the confines of that traditional training course or training environment that we might have thought of previously. And there's certainly, I think, a place for bringing everybody together, but it's just about exploiting all the other opportunities. So that was all. I'm finding it difficult to keep up with all these comments in the side. Andrew, I don't know how you're doing it.
Oh, I don't know if I am, to be honest. But I think Paul Matheson, I think you've maybe got two here, Paul. One reflecting on kind of leadership in the past and whether it's relevant for today, and one down below about the number of changes within the organisation. So perhaps Paul Matheson could maybe ask these questions. That would be great. I don't know if Paul is on the line still.
he's got no video.
No video or mic. Okay, I don't know if the panel have had a chance to read either of those two comments.
Colin Atkinson's had his hand up for a wee further, and we could read through Paul's question where we're, Colin's maybe reading his out and then get back to Paul's questions. Is that all right?
Sure, no problem. Sorry, Colin, I didn't spot your hand up, but I did see your comment. So yeah, feel free to open your mic and ask a question.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, everyone. I also have 2 kids running around, so if you hear things crashing and banging, don't send the police. It's not a problem. It's not a COVID party. It's just my kids being kids. The question I had was this. A lot of the discussion so far has been around strategic leadership and values-based leadership and ethics within an organisation, which I think is always really helpful and is definitely an important part of the overall leadership framework or ethos for a modern contemporary police organisation. The question I had was a bit more granular than that. And the question is, are there any particular challenges about developing police staff, civilian police staff, as a particular cohort within policing? Because I'm conscious that they've not come up in discussion so far. And it's an academic interest of mine, but also as a previous member of police staff for a considerable period of time, it's also something that I've experienced firsthand. There is some, at least my recollection would be that there's training and development for some police staff from a management perspective, but from a leadership perspective, that seemed to me to be a little bit more lacking in comparison to the police officer cohort. And I think that has real implications within policing, both in terms of talent development and talent retention as well. It links into the fact that the police officer cohort is much more dynamic, right, in terms of its fluidity, its movement across the organisation, 2 years here, 2 years there, picking up skills as you go along, moving up the ranks. Whereas when you become a member of police staff, you can be in a role for a significant period of time until somebody retires or leaves the organisation or moves on and an opportunity comes up. So the opportunities for development within your role are much more limited. That leads me to the last reflection I have, which is, does that mean that we should be seeking to instill, I guess from a cultural perspective, an organisational perspective, a more distributed leadership model rather than the type of, as Denise mentioned, hierarchical command and control, that's not my pay grade type of model that can sometimes culturally percolate through policing?
And that's a really good question. I mean, the nature of policing command and management and leadership is necessarily very broad. And I think you're actually touching on one of the questions that Paul asked here about, why the difficulties of police officers in leadership positions only being there temporarily. When I became a divisional commander, I was in charge of everything that went on in that division that required a policing response or interest, whether it be a criminal investigation, policing of an event, response to a community problem, a public health issue, any of these things. And therefore, what I've found as my development through the ranks is to allow me to actually take on that position. It benefited very much from being exposed to all these different things at different levels. So where I would actually have direct responsibility if I was in the CID for criminal investigation, where I actually would have if I was involved in specialist policing, direct supervision at sergeant or inspector level in policing an event. If it was a complaint about the police or a professional standards problem, having the operational experience of dealing with a complaint, working in a change environment and understanding how change impacts on the organisation, being able to lead that. All of that broad development, I think, is required to make a very effective police leader. And what that means, unfortunately, is that you tend not to stay in one role very long. So that I think I understand the frustration that comes from partners and also from members of staff, that they would sometimes, you know, seem as if they've got a new leader every week who'll come in with his or her own ideas about how to lead, and that can create frustration. But I actually think it's on balance, it's a bit of a necessary evil in order to develop individuals who have got competence at dealing with such a broad area of responsibilities at senior levels. I think the point that you make, Colin, round about police staff leadership is very relevant, and I think there really is, if I'm being perfectly open, a disparity in terms of the structure of leadership, which I think calls a bit into our history as an organisation, a long history where we've been very policing focused. And when I joined the police, the person in charge of HR was an inspector. You know, the person in charge of finance was a chief inspector. You know, and that kind of jack of all trades view of things. And then we decided, you know, that maybe police officers weren't very good at that, and we actually started employing professionals, which led to a period of very specialised recruitment of police staff. So you're recruiting someone with HR skills, you're recruiting someone with finance skills, who perhaps didn't have the broad skills to develop through the organisation, or the will or desire to develop in a broad sense through the organisation. I think we've evolved a bit since then, and as Brian, I'm sure Brian will come in and speak about the leadership programmes and what he's found. It's not just for police officers, it's actually for our police staff, because I think where we would like to be in a few years' time is in a place where those opportunities are as available to police staff to diversify and broaden their leadership throughout the organisation as they are to police officers.
I can certainly speak a little bit about that, just following on from Gary's point there. I think that what we certainly found, and this was in line with my own experience when I was part of the organisation, was that police staff, supervisors do go on the first line managers course, for example, but part of the challenge that we found around that was that it's one of the conditions of a sergeant's probationary period that they must complete that course before they're finished their 1 year probation as a sergeant, which means there's a big demand for police officers to go in that course, and there is a significant number of police staff waiting to go on the course. So typically you would maybe only have 1 or 2 people on a course of 24 from police staff, which is not an equitable balance, clearly. So there's a challenge there for the force in terms of that. But my experience of being in courses with police staff members is that they add a lot of value and different perspective to the course. So it's not about what you're wearing on your shoulder. These courses, this is about actually getting the best out of people through your interpersonal skills. I think Paul's point about tenure is really, and in this one I'm not speaking for HMICS, it's a personal viewpoint I'm going to express here. I think it's a really important point that Paul's making, and I think there's something there about taking on board what Gary's saying as well. It's important that some people are identified as, you know, potential ACCs who need to experience, you know, a range of different opportunities, but there are other people who might want to be an area commander, and that's their career goal, or a divisional commander, and that was certainly my ambition. I wanted to be a divisional commander, and that was it. So I think there's something about how people are recruited into some of these posts that they need to understand that there are key roles within the organisation where, you know, the partnership is so reliant upon that consistency that there is an expectation of 2 or 3 years at least tenure from people moving into them, because it certainly doesn't help when you've got people moving in and out, you know, as you've described in your comment there, Paul, a number of people that you've seen going through some of those roles doesn't help. It doesn't help the individual doing the job either, because you need to be in that role for a while before you really start to feel comfortable in it.
I'm just going to make a brief comment, Andrew, because I see there is a couple of kind of questions that to try and get to, because we are kind of, time always flies, doesn't it, when you're having fun. So time is kind of like moving on. But Colin, I mean, I was also, you know, part of the police as a civilian many years ago. And part of the reason that I left because there was lack of opportunity and development, funnily enough. But also I moved on to do my PhD, so it was two reasons. But yeah, I mean, that's one thing we found in the learning development research, was that it was a concern that particularly civilian staff, that they felt that they weren't necessarily, I think some of them understood the reasons why that was the case, but they didn't necessarily feel that they had the same development opportunities. And I think, you know, if we think about certainly workforce, you know, transformation as is kind of been set out, I think both by, you know, the Policing Strategy 2026 in Scotland, although, you know, I know we're kind of developing new strategies all the time, Policing Vision 2025, which is soon to become Policing Vision 2030. It's about workforce transformation, and to me that includes the whole workforce. So actually we need to make sure that we're thinking about, because the organisation, yes, obviously, you know, officers are critical, but I would argue that staff are also critical to the functioning of that organisation. So really you need to think about the development opportunities for all your staff. And I think traditionally that's not been the case. I do see that kind of change, and I've seen really good examples where, you know, staff were given opportunities to develop. But again, I think it's quite inconsistent. I think some forces, from my experience, do it well. Some forces don't do it so well. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you. I see we've got a couple of people with hands up in the chat here. So Michael and Helen, I was going to come to Michael first and then Helen. If you could keep your points as brief as possible, that will allow us to get through the questions, hopefully before 6.
Yeah, good afternoon. It's just a quick leadership question specific to COVID, really. Obviously in England, with a number of different chief constables we have, you've seen a different varieties of approaches to enforcement and dealing with the regulations. Just in terms of Police Scotland, just be interested to know, with having just the one force and one senior leadership team, do you think that's been beneficial in the way you've dealt with it in terms of public confidence?
Yes, is a very simple answer to that. And I think I mentioned that in my intro, that we've really benefited from having that consistency of approach. Now, that's not to say that in every single area, every incident was dealt with in the same way. You know, you need to take local context into account in these things. And for example, when we were in a tiered system, you know, where we're, and this didn't really get to it, to be perfectly frank, for any length of time, because the risk of infection just suddenly increased again, as you know. But our intention was, and our messaging was to our officers about, if you're in a tier 4 where there's a big risk of transmission of infection, you maybe want to batter through the first 3 E's a bit quicker than you would in a tier 1. And so while I think there was a consistency of messaging, a consistency in terms of our strategy, and we didn't see the varying nature of approach like we did in forces south of the border, we still retained that flex to make sure that we kind of reflected the unique nature of whatever community we were policing at the time.
Thanks. Helen, do you have a quick point to make? Helen Meldrum.
Hi, Andrew. Yes, thank you. Just to make you aware of my position, I hold a leadership and management portfolio in leadership and talent for Police Scotland, and have been working quite closely with Brian during the HMICS inspection. And actually, I hold about 6 of the recommendations that have came out of that inspection. And I just wanted to really maybe give some comfort and reassurance around the fact that those recommendations are being taken forward, and maybe to provide a little bit of insight into the fact that the leadership framework for Police Scotland is developed having it as a sustainable model during such volatile times in society at the moment has been problematic with access to the organisation, for example, due to COVID. But we are working on it and hoping to have a sustainable model, certainly starting to impact the organisation this year and addressing the backlogs that we've had. And all those products that are within leadership and talent, from a CPD and leadership perspective, are open to everyone and have been developed for staff and officers. So it's just to get a bit of reassurance around that. In respect of that sustainability, maybe I would quite like to ask one question myself. We have a model where our budgets are one-year planning budgets, which is difficult, particularly when we know we've got the challenges that we have financially, to actually plan that long-term model of sustainability in relation to our offerings. And I just wondered if there was any plans for us to have a longer financial planning model that would allow us to really bring about sustainable leadership and training practices.
Are you asking me that? Probably need to ask the government. We're still. I don't know if the director or the chief financial officers in the line will be able to give a more accurate response than I can. But the truth of the matter is, as you'll know, Helen, we're still dealing with a structural deficit. We're still about £72 million short from where we should be, just to put the model that we've got onto the street. So it's hard to commit beyond those financial restraints that we have at the moment. I'm getting into territory I don't understand, so I better shut up before I say something that gets me into trouble.
No problem, thank you.
I actually wouldn't mind. I mean, I think, you know, you're quite right about what you say in terms of, because I know I've worked with Police Scotland for a number of years, and certainly I know that there is opportunities available there, but I think the point you make about finances and resources is actually one of the critical points, because that's what we found was one of the sort of barriers to actually getting some of this stuff done within the organisation. And I think what you've highlighted is actually, it's not always about the availability of opportunity, but it's actually the restrictions or broader restrictions of other policies, you know, other kind of external issues to the organisation that actually then make it really difficult to ensure that you have a holistic approach to learning and development. So, you know, finance is just one of them. There's a huge amount of different barriers that can actually impact upon ensuring that everybody does get the relevant learning and development. So I think that's for me the critical point that you've raised.
Thanks, Denise. I think I'm just conscious of time.
Could I just come in very quickly? If that's
Sorry,
okay?
Brian. Sure.
No, it was just in the back of Helen's comments, and I think, you know, I'm genuinely not just saying this, Helen. I think people would know me well enough. But what we certainly found during that inspection was that, particularly the leadership and talent team, there's some fantastic people who've been recruited into the organisation there, with some great ideas about, you know, how to provide better career development opportunities, better leadership training throughout the organisation. And what I'm certainly hopeful for, and I've been encouraged in the back of that report, is that there is a good direction of travel around that. You know, I've been given quite a number of updates, and as Helen says, each of those recommendations have been assigned to specific people through that action plan. And there's, despite the challenges of the last year, there has been progress, so there's encouraging signs ahead, and it's just to say, I'm not going to comment anything in the budget, because that is certainly not my place. It's a challenging one though.
Thank you, Brian. I think just in the interest of time, we should be kind of wrapping up now. I just wanted to go to Brian Anderson's question, which I think kind of wraps up a lot of the conversation, and he's asking what the panel consider to be the greatest leadership challenge going forward, and what values would you apply to that, and what kind of outcomes. And I guess attached to that, I'm just intrigued if there's anything from the sort of COVID zombie apocalypse that you've discussed, Gary, if there's anything that Police Scotland, what kind of key learnings do you think as an organisation you'll take forward from the last 10 months of policing?
Okay, lots of leadership challenges, I suppose. Keeping it. Thanks for that question, Brian. Putting us in the spot. Probably most recently, the biggest challenge I've got was I was responsible for ensuring that our police officers were issued with PPE at the start of the pandemic. I was out the room when they allocated responsibilities, so that was why I got that one. And we came to a point where we had no supply of the proper equipment because of the nature of the supply lines. So everybody was looking for masks and protective wear. We had really strong concerns being expressed by our officers who felt that they were getting placed at risk every time that they were asked to carry out their duties in public. We had strong political pressure on us from government by saying, well, don't take all the masks because we need them for the NHS. So that was when I got that responsibility, that was a real pressure I felt for me, and I really did feel the weight of responsibility on there in order to be able to navigate those choppy waters and make sure our officers were protected. Now we did it, and I've never been a rule breaker. I've always been a wee bit of an upholder, I think, in respect of what my responsibilities are, and in a very keen sense of where the limits of my responsibilities are. I broke them in the first day, probably, and then I continued to break them because I found that I quite enjoyed that in respect of what my limits were for purchasing or allocating or making decisions, and that's perhaps an indication of what we've been speaking about earlier tonight, where when you're placed in that situation, you just actually make the leadership decisions that you need to make in order to achieve the outcome. So you'll know we managed to get 14,000 officers trained and equipped within about 7 weeks, which I think wasn't just actually down to me. That was far more down to the people who were working for me at the time and the blood, sweat and tears that they put into it. But that was a significant leadership challenge, just because I think of the weight of responsibility I felt more than anything else. And very quickly, Andrew, to answer your question, that adherence to our values and having at our heart of our decision making a very keen sense of how our actions will affect our legitimacy, and seeing that played out in a public health approach is probably the biggest learning, and I think perhaps the biggest positive that we could take from what we've gone through over the past year.
Okay, thank you very much. We are on 6 o'clock, so I'm going to finish it there. I think Andrew's already said thank you to everybody for your questions and comments. I think we probably could have kept kind of going for a little bit longer, but people need to eat and I now need a gin and tonic. So no, thank you very much. Also, just wanted to say briefly before people do leave that if anybody has got any comments, please feel free to email me, because we are going to write a kind of briefing paper looking at the themes of the webinars. We will have another webinars. The next one will be towards the end of February. So look out for details of that. This is going to be a series. We're going to look at a different theme each week. And I would just like finally to say thank you so much to all the participants. Thank you to Andrew Ruth for helping with the chat and the questions, but mainly thank you to my fellow panel members for joining us this evening. I know you're both very busy people, so thank you very much for giving up your time to join us. Thanks for your insights. Really, really great to have this conversation. So thank you, ACC Ritchie and Brian. I really, really appreciate your time. So thank you and good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Denise.
Bye.
Bye. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
There we go. Monica, are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, I just thought I'd hang around just in case there was anything you needed me to do.
How do I save the chat?
I was literally just looking at how to do that. I've done it on WebEx, but I've not done it here. Let's see. Must be a way.
Fran, do you know how to well, she's leaving. She's leaving. I wasn't sure how to do it. I better stop recording actually.
Oh yeah.